The title of today's event is Rethinking Edmonton Infill, the Next Chapter. It's forward-looking. We had planned to have John Pasalis from Toronto as one of our speakers, but he had to pull out earlier this week for personal reasons. So we've made a very quick adaptation. There are many things involved in good infill and successful densification. This session today concentrates on two: economics and design. Here's the program. David Crittenden is going to speak for around 20 minutes on a handful of economic issues and myths. Barry Johns is going to speak for around 20 minutes on sharing some of his thoughts on design. We'll take questions for 35 or 45 minutes. There's a mic in the center of the room there. And then often the most important part of a meeting is the meeting that happens after the meeting. So we invite you to linger afterwards, have a coffee, have one of those cookies, and talk with each other, share ideas, meet people from other parts of the city who share your concerns. So enough from me, on to our first speaker. David Crittenden hails from Calgary, but established roots in Edmonton over 15 years ago, following his graduate studies in economics at the University of Alberta. Although housing wasn't his academic focus, he became deeply engaged in the topic 3 years ago, spurred by an interest in local planning and community changes. This journey led him to intensive research, reading, and community advocacy, examining complex housing issues such as affordability, zoning reform, and tax policy. David has been a key organizer of today's event, and until Tuesday, thought he was going to be the moderator. Let's just say his last few days have been very busy. Let's give David a warm welcome.
Thank you, Kevin. As Kevin was kind of mentioning, a few months ago when Kevin and I met and discussed the idea of an in-person speaker and networking event, I thought it was a fantastic idea. What I didn't expect was that I would be the one standing on stage, presenting to a nearly full room of 100 plus, 150 people. So maybe this wasn't the idea I necessarily set out to do, but all kidding aside, I'm genuinely grateful for the incredible show of support. I know that this room is full of exceptionally interesting individuals, diverse backgrounds, experiences, and perspectives. I strongly encourage you, as Kevin did, to meet your neighbors, connect with people, and really understand things going forward. Our goal is simple. We want to explore, understand, and challenge ideas about housing and infill within an Edmonton context. For me, I think we've seen a profound shift in the role that housing has played in our society, and the economy of housing has fundamentally changed. Our homes are no longer just shelters, they're assets in somebody else's portfolio. This is a systematic shift, is actively reshaping our cities, creating environments that are pricing entire generations out of homeownership, creating the kind of narrative that it's just a dream. Yet, every time we ask why, we're fed a narrative that it's merely about the crisis of scarcity. The proposed fix is always the same. If cities simply just loosened zoning bylaws, lowered taxes, reduced fees for builders, industry would ramp up its production, home prices would fall, rents would stabilize, and affordability would fundamentally return. We're told it's just a basic problem of supply and demand. But let me challenge a little bit of that narrative. So let's return to a basic concept we cover in Economics 101. Two curves, the one in red is the supply curve, demand in blue. Where they meet together is where the market determines price and quantity. Simply put, if we increase supply, the shifting curve moves to the right, and the quantity of houses increases and prices fall, right? It's a simple concept. It's hopefully easy to understand, and it kind of rolls off the tongue, supply and demand. But the reality of, unfortunately, is a bit more complex. the story isn't just about supply, it's about ownership, incentives, policy, and at its core, it's about a fundamental choice in our economy today. Do we want our homes to be places that where families build their lives, or should they be wealth generate engines for investors? So let me start by providing a couple quick definitions, because I think the language we use is important. When I say home or housing, I'm not exclusively talking about our traditional detached home. I mean all forms of shelter: row homes, apartments, detached, semi-detached, different types of living environments and scenarios. When I say families, I'm not just talking about a traditional family. I'm thinking about the diversity in the ways we live today. This ranges from somebody who lives alone, to a couple, to roommates, to families, children, senior living situations, multi-generations, and they evolve over time, of course, as every one of us knows. So, the question becomes, let's unpack the supply side idea with some data. Are we building enough? Do we have an issue of undersupply in Canada and in Alberta's context in particular? I'm an economist, so I love graphs. But if we look at G7 countries, the blue line at the top is what we typically makes up a household by country, or the number of individuals who live in a dwelling. 2.53 individuals in America, 2.467 in Canada, and all the way on the far right, Germany, 2.0. The bars underneath are the number of homes we need to house 1,000 people. Or put another way, if we have 1,000 new residents appear, how many homes do we need to support them? In Canada's case, it's 405 homes per 1,000. So then if we look at how many homes we actually build, housing starts is one metric that they look at. The green bars here are the number of dwellings built per year from 2003 to 2023. The blue line above it is the number of housing starts per capita, if you will, by per 1,000. Remember that magic number of 405? In the last 20 years, we've never dropped below that number. And in many years, we actually far exceed it. So we're actually building a lot of homes in Canada. And you notice that the two actually follow each other fairly nicely. That actually suggests that the market is actually pretty responsive to housing need. This builds off of work that's done by Steve Pomeroy. He's out of Carleton University in Ottawa. He, as I hope I've tried to illustrate here, finds, and I quote, little evidence of chronic undersupply, Canada-wide or in our 8 largest metropolitan areas, except one anomalous case in 2023 in the city of Toronto. And you'll see in a couple slides, a potential reason as to why that was the case. So while those are Canadian numbers, this is the Alberta context, and I won't linger on this page very much and go into the details of it, but it's a similar story here in Alberta. And these findings aren't just reached by Pomeroy. It's not a one-off by any means. A study by the International Monetary Fund in 2018 showed the responsiveness of housing to supply rises in demand. So how do economies actually handle this? How do countries handle this? 20 events countries over the last 30 years. Canada was the second most responsive, or in economic terms, elastic market in those 20 countries. Bank of Montreal economists have published many similar findings, and there's a lot more. But perhaps we should or could build. The theory of this is the theory of abundance. It's that if gatekeepers, if cities kind of got out of the way, if they loosen zoning, if the governments would legalize housing, incentivize and subsidize the industry, supply would flood the market. Housing issues would resolve. But I think you probably know where I'm going with this, but the Canadian Housing and Mortgage Corporation continues to structure programs and reflect this narrative. In 2022, they pushed the claim that to restore affordability in Canada, we need to triple the housing starts in the next 10 years. what volume do we actually build in Canada? Well, graphically, it looks like this. The orange line at the bottom is housing completions. This is the number of homes we build by year. And the blue line above it is population, effectively how many people we add to our economy. Remember that scenario in Toronto in 2023? This might explain it from a population standpoint. But instead building basically 200,000 homes per year, and that is from 91 to 2024. The CHMC thinks we need to build 600,000 annually. They think this is, one, achievable, and two, is actually required. In presenting this solution and designing programs that fit this narrative, they suggest that the surge in supply will gradually lower prices on homes and rents. As builders continue to flood the market with supply, home prices would fall, and we would solve the issue of housing. This, of course, is served on a number of levels, and I'll unpack a couple of key here ones for you to think about and mention. One, we almost entirely rely on private sector for development. Private builders don't oversupply markets, at least if they want to stay in business. When something takes months or years to build and the prices are falling or they're depreciating, builders' marginal costs and marginal revenues become a factor. I won't go into exactly what all those details mean, but they curtail production. They stop producing. They simply don't keep on building houses when the numbers don't work. We just need to look at Toronto in the recent news to support this. Basically, housing starts have almost come to a complete halt. Supply, so that's private sectors for building. Of course, the supply to a market isn't just constrained by zoning and financing. There are a lot of inputs that go into building our homes. Think about the labor that's involved, people that swing hammers. Think about the goods and products that actually go into the creation of a building, municipal infrastructure, the pipes, the roads. Market demand, like product mix, like what do people actually want to live in, geography. The idea that the largest industry in the country by far can actually just triple production overnight is an interesting one, to say the least. Attempts to increase supply and zoning, well, we've been doing this for a long time, for years. Governments have developed and put billions of dollars into programs that are trying to shift that supply curve. And if those impacts were as loud as the narrative, wouldn't we see that in the data? Wouldn't we see huge changes in the amount of homes completions? And the reality of it is we don't. So what's actually going on? You know, if it's not directly housing and supply and demand, housing is, of course, complicated, but let's cut through the noise. If we acknowledge that Canadian housing supply is already responsive and that we indeed are continuing to work to build, what's the root cause of skyrocketing prices in our cities and across the world? The answer isn't scarcity, it's financialization of housing. So what does that mean? Consider a family looking to buy their first home. 40, 50 years ago, the almost exclusively housing demand was driven by families. In that era, home prices were tied and constrained by household income, meaning your ability to buy a home was limited by how much money you made, you saved, and you could borrow. As a simple rule of thumb, if you looked at a market like Toronto and across the country, you can basically borrow or buy a home between 3 and 5 times your income. So if you made 12 grand a year back in the 70s, you potentially could look at a home budget somewhere between 36 and maybe as high as 60, but you were kind of limited in that regard. But a family today and firms and investors play a much more dominant role. Unlike families, investors aren't constrained by income, they buy with capital. For families, they're still constrained by income, savings, access to credit, but they have an imposed stress test, which is again kind of tied to how they access funds. Their tax rate and savings is very different than what a corporation's is. They can get amortization of 25 years, in some circumstances 30. Their down payment minimums are between 5 and 20%. You know, anybody who's been involved in buying a home, you all know these fundamental things. By comparison, investors, which, by the way, come in all forms. They can be mom and pop investors, people that own 2 or 3 rental properties, even a secondary property, but they can also be large institutional investors. They have a huge advantage over households in this market. They're unrestricted by income, they buy with capital, they aren't stress tested or income tested in the same way. There are lower taxes, they have advantages in pre-purchasing from a tax perspective. They have builder programs that provide favorable financing and government-backed securities that allow them to amortize a project or a building over 50 years. They have a low cash outlay, so they don't have to pay as much as you or I when we go to purchase a property through a program like MLI Select. And you can layer in components like technology. So a corporate investor, say an Amherst Capital, they can find, analyze new property listings every single day before a family even has a chance to pour coffee on in the morning. They can have cash offers into buyers before the family's agents even have a chance to set up a showing. So how is a family supposed to compete against that in a market, right? The serious consequences of investor-driven housing market is that it inflates home prices. Unlike end users and families whose again, household income is the determining factors, investors wield access to a significant amount more capital. This superior buying power allows them to outbid regular buyers. They acquire multiple properties. Investor demand doesn't just increase the competition, it fundamentally reshapes a pricing dynamic in our market, relentlessly putting home values upward and eventually locking out first-time home buyers, particularly with certain housing conditions. And so a market like Toronto in blue and Vancouver in pink now have home price ratios. So this is we've moved from this 3.5 to 5 times borrowing power or need to actually get an average home, as I described before, to 10 to 15 times annual incomes. It's completely unattainable. And we can see this in other data. This is looking at the relative market ownership. The Bank of Canada basically publishes this information. They track 3 things: first-time home buyers, repeat buyers, and investors. So from 2014 to 2024, we see that first-time home buyer ownership declining. Repeat home buyers, this is somebody buying a new, has a home, buying something else, also declining. But in a relatively short period, in 10 years, investor share of homes in Canada grew from 20 to 30% of the overall market. That's a 50% increase in their market share. In Alberta, in green in Edmonton, orange in Calgary, red is the national average, we've remained arguably within line of affordable ratios and incomes. And most of us know that, how affordable our city is. We've not had the same decoupling of income from house prices, affordability challenges that we've seen in Toronto or Vancouver. But things are changing. And Calgary, we see large-scale investment dollars from Toronto marching into Calgary initially in 2022 and in Edmonton in 2023. And you can start to see the Calgary number in 2020, and basically as we come out of the pandemic, it starts to sort of increase and separate from where we are here today in Edmonton. However, so let's look at a more localized example. And think about programs that the Canadian Housing and Mortgage Corporation has put together. A program like MLI Select might seem like a good program on its surface, a reasonable trade-off to correct a market imbalance by offering incentives and favorable finances to the industry in exchange for them providing something like affordable housing. for 10 years, affordable rental housing. However, in markets like Edmonton, blanket rezoning deregulation in concert with incentives have created the perfect and yet predictable storm for investors. The combination of low developable land costs, high Alberta incomes, this is our Alberta advantage, right? Make almost any multifamily rental project here, particularly on single sites, maximizing complexes with market rate basement suites. We can talk a little bit more about exactly what that means, but immediately qualify for this program. They effectively use taxpayer-backed finances to supercharge investment in acquisition and development. Keep in mind, this isn't true in most markets across the country. The acquisition of homes like the one on the left and the conversion to these product types on the right are praised by supply-side advocates, they're saying we're adding a supply, but to what effect? This site has removed ownership opportunity for families. It's not a property that will likely circle back in even when that investor is done with the property, circle back in for an opportunity for a single, a traditional family or another group to actually buy. It becomes a financial asset class or product that really only shifts between investors. Because this thing costs somewhere between $2 and $2.8 million in today's terms relative to, a very modest home, mid-century home on the left. And perhaps we're doing this at the risk of other projects and other opportunities to build in our city. We started by questioning the supply side narrative. I think the data's relatively clear, though we don't hear a whole lot of that in our discourse. The market is responsive. We're building at historical pace. We continue to ramp. The issue isn't a supply failure. It's a systematic structural failure, and it's fundamentally financializing our homes. Policies intended to cool and fuel supply only succeed in sidelining families. And investor capital, unconstrained by income, has supercharged by government programs and policies that dominate our market in particular, resulting in a 50% surge in investor market share. That also sends the market into, and it's a really important concept, is this decoupling from income. So let's stop chasing the futile promise of only thinking about supply side economics. Let's confront the choice. The core choice from my perspective is, do we want homes to be places where families build their lives and plan for retirement, or should they be wealth generators for investors? The decision we make on this question here in Edmonton and across the country, I think will have profound impacts on our society moving forward. Thank you.